Thank you, and good afternoon. Welcome. Sorry for the weather. I'm sure this has been lamented already. Most days it's very sunny and warm here, so today's the exception. So my name is Frank Clooney. I'm the director of the Center for the Study of World Religions, which is across the street. We'll be having a reception afterwards. You're all welcome to come across the street for as long or as little amount of time as you can spare. And the center is an incredibly important part of Harvard Divinity School. I think it's a fairly unique divinity school that it has a center like this. The center was founded in 1960 in order to foster, even more than half a century ago, comparative study, interreligious study, the learning across religious boundaries. And from 1960 on until now, it has striven in various ways to have interfaith work, interreligious study, the study of specific religious traditions fostered. So last night we had a lecture on Korean Buddhism, for instance. We also have events on Islam or Hinduism or Christianity. So try to foster the different religions. And then the interface, the conversations across religious boundaries, common problems to different religions, issues of justice, issues of misunderstanding across boundaries. For instance, a couple of months ago, we had a session at the center on the that controversial film that was made about Islam. Do you remember that one that caused all the uproar? We had a discussion of that film and the issues of understanding, misunderstanding, and the misuse of the media. We had, for our annual social justice lecture a few weeks ago, Ibu Patel, the founder of the Interfaith Youth Corps, who in this very room made a very eloquent case for constantly expanding the boundaries of interfaith conversation. That even in interfaith circles, it becomes easy for people in one tradition to talk to people just like themselves in the other tradition. Liberals talking to liberals, conservatives to conservatives, and kind of challenging us to keep kind of pushing those boundaries if we're really serious about working with one another. So the center has a variety of activities. There are faculty reading groups. There are breakfast discussions for visiting fellows. There are specific events of various sorts for MDiv, MTS students, lunches, programming. And we have a residential community at the center. And some of you may want to think of this as you move, if you come here next year, to consider living at the center. There's an application process and so on. But right from its beginning in 1960, the center was meant to be people of different backgrounds, different cultures, different religious traditions living in the same space with their own private space for their own study and so on, but also able to come out and in a living context to share with one another, to bounce their ideas off each other and kind of build a community in the middle of the campus. And that's quite exciting. 3 of our residents this year are junior fellows of the center doing work for the center, and this is something, of course, would be available to you as well. One, Axel Takash, is doing work, comparative theological work, trying to engage in getting speakers and students of different traditions to think theologically across religious boundaries. Another of our fellows, Kanchuk Sering, is a visiting Tibetan student, and her interest is in minority traditions or less studied traditions. So we're always talking about the big traditions that get a lot of study. What about traditions that are neglected or kind of pushed to the side? She's been bringing in a series of speakers precisely to bring the limelight to these different traditions. And then Leslie Hubbard is our 3rd junior fellow. How do you understand and access religion, not simply through the text, but through dance, through music, through chanting, through performance, through poetry? And again, trying to have a series of activities at the center. So it's a very creative environment. And I think if you come here, just to remember that it's really one of the only such divinity schools in the country that has something so prominent as this 50-plus-year-old center as part of it in the programming we have. When you come over, if you can, after this session for the reception, you'll be able to see the artwork, some of the history of the center, and so on. But the main thing we're doing today at this particular event, under the title of The Study of Religions in a Religiously Diverse World, is to raise a distinctive feature of the Divinity School. And I'm sure this has been said to you in many different ways during your time here so far, that this is a diverse environment in a diverse religious world. So the world around us is incredibly cosmopolitan, but more than most divinity schools, the center, Divinity School, Harvard itself, is a very diverse place. And people of different faith backgrounds, different faith perspectives, different personal pathways living in this environment, studying here. And in all the classes one finds oneself in, there are so many different angles, so many different questions coming in, even on the most traditional topics. So if a professor is teaching something, let's say on New Testament or ethics or Buddhist history, the students in the class are an unpredictable mix of students out of different backgrounds. So how do you study religion in a diverse world when you yourselves, we ourselves in the classrooms, are diverse and of different backgrounds? That's an exciting part of being here. And the way we do this today is, rather than having a heavy-duty discussion at the end of the day when you're probably tired of talking on study or religions or diversity, to have three of our representatives and best products of the system here, the school and the center, to give their stories, how they came to do what they do, how they came to be interested in Harvard, why they came here, and what their experience has been. And hopefully their accounts and then the time we have for discussion afterwards will enable you to engage in some of the imagining about your story in relation to their story. So I'll introduce each speaker briefly, and then they'll go in the order in which I introduce them. So sitting in the middle here, we have John Winter. John is a second-year MDiv student who lives at the center across the street. John received his BA in Contemplative Psychology from the Buddhist-inspired Naropa University in Boulder, Colorado, where he studied among scholars and practitioners of many of the world's wisdom traditions, including the contemplative branches of Judaism, Christianity, Hinduism, and Buddhism. John focuses his study here on Buddhism and psychology, focuses his studies there, on Buddhism and psychology, and later served as the program director for the Dharma Ocean Foundation, an organization that hosts meditation retreats across the United States. John came to HDS in order to deepen his studies in Buddhism while simultaneously engaging or exploring nonprofit leadership as a ministerial path. And then on the far left, we have Gibran Chavez-Gudino. Hebron also lives at the center across the street. He is a second-year MTS student. He went to college at the University of San Diego, which, as you may know, is a Catholic university. After graduating in 2011, he came here to HDS. He is set to graduate this coming May. Hebron's interreligious travel, as he put it to me in describing how he would talk today, was in the very fact of coming to the United States from Mexico. Being born in Mexico and coming to the U.S. was interreligious travel. He's from a very small town in Mexico where more than 90% of the population were Mexican Catholics. Before coming to the U.S., he tells me he had never gotten to know or befriend a Protestant, let alone somebody from a faith tradition other than Christianity. So there's a great story there from the village to HDS. And Hebron was kind enough to point out to me that one of his opening academic courses for thinking about these issues was a course he took with me in interreligious theology last year. So I'll pay him extra for that afterwards. And then finally, on the closer end here, Rebecca Klein Esterson is a history in herself, vast experience. Rebecca received her MTS degree from HDS in 2002, so a while back, with a focus in world religions. While at HDS, she studied various theological and historical perspectives, aspects of Islam, Judaism, Christianity, and focused on sacred texts. She had a scholarship from Harvard's Center for Jewish Studies and was able to live and study in Jerusalem for 3 semesters as part of her study. As a visiting student at Hebrew University, she furthered her language work and also the study of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. After graduating, that's only the first part of the story, she worked at the center for 9 years. She was our programming director for 9 years, wonderful stalwart pillar of the institution, and can tell you many, many stories about the center and how things have worked out over the years. And one of the last things she did before leaving was a wonderful presentation on interfaith marriages. So kind of taking her learning and personal story and then putting these together in terms of what are the dynamics of a household, a family that has an interfaith element to it. And now, third part of the story, Rebecca is in the second year of her PhD program in the Division of Religious and Theological Studies at BU across the river. She's studying the history of the relationship between Judaism and Christianity over the interpretation of the Bible and the phenomenon known as Christian Hebraism. She is a teaching fellow this semester for a course called The Bible as Literature. And when she finishes her degree, she'll be teaching at the Swedenborgian House of Studies at the Pacific School of Religion in the GTU. So 3 different stories, 3 different backgrounds, and we'll hear from them beginning with John. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. And thank you, everybody, for coming out today. I know it's probably been a really long day, and I hope Harvard is treating you well. I hope you're having a good time visiting all the different seminars and discussions and panels and everything that you do on these kinds of days. And I hope you're learning everything that you need to be learning that's going to be helpful. So on that note, I was thinking, can everybody hear me okay? So my intention when I was forming my thoughts for what to talk about today, I thought I would basically talk pretty informally with you guys. My hope is just to garner for you some sense of what it's been like from my background to be here studying in such a religiously diverse environment. And of course, you're getting just kind of a little sliver through the cracks of the walls when you see it through my eyes. And then of course, it'll broaden with these 2 folks here. And but really encourage you to talk to as many students as you can to get as many diverse views as you can, just because there's so much going on here at Harvard and so many experiences even just going through the CSWR, which is the focus of our talk tonight, that I think just you will never run out of good perspectives and interesting backgrounds of people. So definitely want to encourage you to do that. I came here with not very solid ideas of exactly what I was going to get out of this education. I tend to, I just had my 31st birthday yesterday, and as I was sitting there sort of feeling all of a sudden older than I thought I was thinking about what to talk about here, and I thought that some of the the most meaningful experiences that I've had in my life, the most meaningful learning experiences, have all been experiences. It hasn't been from some sort of theory that I read or whatnot. It's been something that I've gone through, and I kind of approach my education that way, and I think of education here especially that way, and just wanted to throw out to you guys that I have found Harvard, but especially with the experiences at the CSWR, to be a really good place to be able to land and have some very rewarding formation experiences as you're here, and kind of finding out who you are and what is going on in the world and what is going on with other people given their backgrounds and their traditions and what brought everybody here. It's just a very powerful and interesting conversation to have, and it's one that's ongoing that I'm continuing to have as I'm here with all of my friends in school, but especially neighbors at the CSWR. So I think of it like, it's kind of like traveling, right? You might read about a place, you might read about the jungles of South America, but it's once you get there, it's an entirely different experience. If you're living with the indigenous tribes, it's going to be more of a life transforming experience than just what you're getting through books. And so here, obviously, we have so many traditions. We have many Christian traditions. We have the Jewish traditions, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, pagan. We have people here who are just undeclared, people just kind of exploring. And so how do we foster really important experiences and important dialogues in that in that kind of an atmosphere? It's potentially very fruitful, right, for having a very pluralistic conversation, and like Frank was just saying in the introduction, this is a very unique and a very powerful opportunity. But then also, as Ibu Patel was saying a couple of weeks ago when he was visiting and actually speaking right here, that it's also easy to fall into the trap where you're just you're really attracting a lot of people who have similar worldviews, even though they're coming from these various traditions in their backgrounds, sort of theologically liberal from each of these backgrounds, right? And so we have the potential, and I think Harvard is always working with the potential just that in the classroom conversations, there's sort of a feeling like, okay, we're all here and we're all kind of on the same page, and we're all have an idea in the back of our minds maybe that we all kind of agree in a certain sort of worldview that actually might not be the case. But then, the question is, how do we get experiences and conversations and things that are going to go further? And that experience will vary from classroom to classroom. And I think that this is exactly where the CSWR and the work that the CSWR is doing, it becomes sort of a motor or a generator at the university of making sure the space is set up for those kinds of conversations to happen for people, for instance, like MDivs like myself, who are coming from different religious traditions, religious backgrounds, to delve more deeply into these kinds of conversations with each other. And then, there's also the fact that Harvard is kind of a culture of its own too, right? So, we have this sort of, academic heritage that is Harvard, that is, a very prestigious heritage that all of us from these different backgrounds are coming to, and sort of navigating that at the same time that we're navigating, the differences between us in our own traditions. So I moved to the CSWR midway through last year. So when I first came to the campus, I basically spent my first semester feeling pretty inundated with the work requirement, and was noticing that a lot of my friends were too, and we weren't necessarily having conversations that were like digging very much deeply outside of the classroom, simply because of workload. Coming to the CSWR midway through the year, I think, for me, it was just a really helpful way to plug more into the community and really start to see, how through the faculty reading groups, the MDiv, MTS lunches, the sort of myriad lectures that are going on, as Frank was saying, are generating a lot more conversation. And then also, so just to kind of fast forward, this year I'm doing a field ed through the Office of Religious and Spiritual Life, which supports the religious and spiritual life of the different student groups on the campus. And in that position, I'm having some really interesting opportunities to interact with student groups that are kind of like doing their own thing that I wouldn't normally have the opportunity to. So, for instance, I was helping the Jewish students build their sukkah at the beginning of Sukkot in early October. And so this brings me to this idea of like having an actual experience that becomes really much more of a learning experience that's deepening the theological education. For me, it was just so here I am with 4 or 5 friends who I've been sitting in classes with now for like a year and a half, but I never really knew that much about their background, other than some theological discussions that we had in class. But suddenly here I am actually building this structure with them and partaking in a ritual that is just so central to who they are and what they do, and kind of everything that they bring to the campus that I didn't see before. I mean, it was always there in the background, but suddenly I'm involved with it, and because we're having this relationship together, kind of unfolding as we're building the sukkah, there's like a mutual conversation that can now kind of flow out between us, simply because there's a connection. So it's a little bit different than if you were to just sit a Buddhist down and a Muslim person down, or Buddhist down and a Jewish person down, or Christian down and a Hindu person down, and say, okay, like now talk about what your beliefs are. But there's something in this activity now that's unfolding that is just kind of a natural outflow of our kind of just being curious about each other and wanting to connect with each other, and then learning in that way about each other's traditions. And I've started seeking those kinds of experiences out more, because it's, now it's no longer just kind of an intellectual thing. Now it's like, oh, this is a really lived experience, and this is an experience now that I'm living, and is being shared with me by these people. So I'm being told I have 3 minutes left. So I want to just let you know that these kinds of interactions for me are becoming probably the most rewarding part of my experience here at Harvard. Let me just look through my notes and make sure there's nothing that I'm going to skip that's important for you guys. Yeah, and just I've also been having deepening friendships with, for instance, one of my coworkers is a really conservative Muslim, and I actually didn't even know this about her at first. I knew she wore the hijab, and we've been having some really, interesting connections and in-depth conversations about our experiences here at Harvard that, and those conversations in themselves are kind of a point where she and I are coming together and talking about how we find the sort of the curriculum in the classrooms and so on. That becomes the sort of center point through which now we are having this like mutual dialogue about our backgrounds and learning about our backgrounds vis-a-vis what it means to be here. And I visited a student group it's a pretty conservative Christian group just earlier this week, and realized that a lot of the things that my Muslim friend was telling me about her experience were really similar to what some of these Christian folks were saying about their experiences. And I've been talking to Buddhists, and they're saying they're having a lot of really similar conversations amongst themselves, but it feels like the spark is kind of ready to be lit, where like we all need to have these conversations with each other. And this is where, again, like the CSWR, I feel like is just waiting right there to make those conversations happen and to assist that in happening. And so, I and one of my Jewish friends are getting together, some of these folks, and we're going to work with Frank and the CSWR, and hopefully, have more of these kinds of conversations. So it's sort of exploring Harvard in general, and then in the midst of that, we are deepening our relationships with each other and our relationship with each other's traditions through those relationships with each other. Okay. Well, thank you guys very much.
Okay. So like Frank mentioned before, my name is Gibran Chavez-Gudino. And for me, when I was thinking about this talk, when I was thinking about the study of religions in a religiously diverse world, I began to think about my own experience, my own upbringing. And ultimately, Frank also mentioned this, my interreligious travel was really coming from the U.S., or coming to the U.S., rather. I'm from a very insular town in Mexico where, over 90% of the population there are Mexican Catholics, which is a very specific kind of Catholic, at least to me, as I would find, as opposed to the Catholics that I would find in Kansas City, where I ended up moving to. So before coming to the U.S., I had never gotten to know or befriended a Protestant, or let alone a person from a faith tradition outside of Christianity. It was all Catholicism all the time. And I mean, it's not like I was sad or anything, but it's just I didn't know that there was something else. It's not that I didn't know that there weren't Protestants out there. It's just that none of them happened to be close to me or members of my family. So I'm from Tangancícuaro, Michoacán, which is a place in the northeastern part of the southwestern Mexican state in Mexico. It's a small town of less than 15,000 people. Other religions, what other religions? at least not publicly. I'm sure the practice of indigenous religions is widespread, but not specifically outwardly, except for maybe during the Day of the Dead celebration, which just happened November 2nd. But even that celebration is very much implicated or welded with Catholicism. At least it was in my hometown. So the way that I grew up listening or talking about, learning about Protestants, it wasn't mainline Protestants, mind you. It was like Jehovah's Witnesses. They were depicted as preying on rancheries of uneducated Catholics. So it was very much regarded as this relationship of ignorance that was implicated if you became a Protestant. So everything was dominated by a very particular Mexican Catholic worldview. For example, butcher shops were closed on Fridays during Lent because as a Catholic, you're not supposed to eat meat on Fridays during Lent. And restaurants didn't serve entrees with meat on them. So again, in this very small 15,000 person town, everyone knows each other and everyone wants to know about each other. And if somebody found out that you weren't Catholic, it could be scandalous. Your business would decline. I remember learning about a burrito stand in El Portal, close to the Central Plaza. And it was scandalous when apparently somebody overheard the businessman, owner of the business saying, hermana, hermano, something like that, which is very much like brother, sister, which is identified as sort of being Protestant-y, I guess. And so it was this huge deal. Like the business really never recovered. It recovered once the son took it over, but it never really recovered after that. Let's see. So coming to the U.S. from this sort of environment was a very drastic change. But it was a change that helped me to grow a lot, and that helped me to understand more about my own tradition and more about my relationship with that tradition and my relationship with that tradition now in this new environment. So in high school, I attended Rockhurst High School, the Jesuit high school in Kansas City, Missouri. There I learned about the richness of my tradition, of my Catholic tradition. I'd been going to Mass forever, every Sunday. But I went there because that's just what everyone did. And that's, it was like the Sunday outing with my grandma and my aunts and uncles and cousins, and we would actually all walk to church. But it wasn't until I really got to high school, until I got to Kansas City, that I became aware of the richness of the Roman Rite, of the succinct sort of meaning within everything in the Mass. And so I learned the tradition more deeply. I began to, as I learned the tradition more deeply, I began to think more about Catholic social teaching. And I learned more about Jesuit values, one of which was being open to growth. So I strive to be open to growth. And again, this openness to growth is important to the study of religions in a diverse world. For college, I went to school at the University of San Diego, which is a Catholic university founded by the Sisters of the Sacred Heart, the RSCJ. At USD was where I first encountered liberation theology in the writings of Gustavo Gutierrez and James Cone. But more importantly for me, I learned about Latino theology from my mentor and friend, Orlando Espin. Latino theology placed my experience as an immigrant in context. I felt as if for the first time the subject of of the class was me. The teacher was talking about my own experiences. My experience as the result of colonialism and of global economic powers beyond my own control. It was really reassuring to me to hear something like that, to sort of value my own experience in this new context, and to value my own traditions in this new context. It was at USD that I began to learn about indigenous traditions of Mexico, as well as those indigenous traditions of the slaves that were forcibly brought to the Americas. It is at USD also that I began coming to terms with Christianity as my own religion, and particularly Catholicism as my own religious tradition, with this newfound realization, a realization of domination. Even though it may not necessarily have been imposed, and we can argue and disagree about that, the conditions of Christianity's arrival and the destruction and at the wake of its arrival were violent and less desirable for everyone in the Americas. One thing that Latino theorists taught me, the people that I began to study with and study at USD, was that we're all part of a non-innocent history. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is that we all have blood on our hands. We all have baggage. No one is innocent. In our past and present, we are implicated and continue to be implicated in structures of domination and violence. The question then becomes, how do we respond? And Latino theorists have responded by recognizing the history. We must recognize and talk about the history in order to address it. We cannot remain silent in the face of any legacy of violence. And ignoring this history would end any sort of productive dialogue. So recognizing this baggage that everyone has, to some degree or another, is important to the study of religions in a religiously diverse world. So the universal and the particular. Most people would agree that justice should be served, that liberty is good, that equality is desirable. However, the proof is in the pudding. What does it mean? What does it mean when it comes to specific matters of politics and social policy? What does it mean when it comes to religion? What does it mean when it comes to day-to-day interactions and relationships with people? And we'll disagree, no doubt, but always with respect. And respect is the foundation of any relationship. Your goal should not be to convert other people to your opinion. It should merely be to explain your own position as a reasonable position within a range of other reasonable positions. And it's okay to disagree. This disagreement, however, should come from an informed decision. When you mobilize any category, you're bound to create problems and cause disruptions to systems of thought. The question then becomes one of strategy. What is your strategy? Why do you choose to go one path over another? These are important questions, and the answers should point to choices that were strategically made, and taking into account repercussions and positive effects of those decisions. That's why I like living at the CSWR. It allows me to put myself in situations to be challenged in the context of being together. Having personal relationships with people changes the way that one sees the other person and the traditions that they stand for. That's why Frank's methodology of interreligious theology is important. It points to a deep truth that having personal relationships and experiences with other traditions, ideas, and methodologies changes the way that one views other traditions as well as the home tradition. So being in HCS in general, it's nice to be in a place where productive discussion can happen interreligiously and interdenominationally, with different sides listening and disagreeing. It's okay to not have all the answers. Oftentimes people get caught up in their own assumptions, and it's useful to acknowledge that we don't have all the answers. So, I mean, turning the question on its head a little bit, like the study of religions in a religiously diverse society or world, why do it? And I think that is why study religions? And I think that's a very personal question. That's a very personal foundation that you have to stand on in order to engage in that. And for me, it comes down to this. It comes down to asking these questions, to opening myself to growth, to recognizing the baggage, to listening, and to respect. And I'm thankful to have found all of those things to some degree or another at the CSWR and at HCS. Thank you.
The only thing I remember about Theological Education Day was being extremely overwhelmed by the day, so I feel you if that's the way you're feeling right now. When I got to HDS, I had two goals. One was to graduate with my MTS degree in 2 years, and the other was to be enrolled in a PhD program within 3 years. 4 years later, I graduated, and 14 years later, I am now in a PhD program. Don't panic. It doesn't usually take people that long. Most people do get through the MTS degree in 2 years. I took that long to do what I had hoped to do so quickly because so many other wonderful, time-consuming things happened in the meantime. I was able to go and study in Jerusalem for 3 semesters, which was life-changing in so many ways. One of them was that I met my husband there. I was able to spend, as Frank mentioned, many, many years working at the Center for the Study of World Religions, which we're hearing so much about tonight, which is really, really a special place and part of what makes Harvard Divinity School truly unique. And I had 2 babies, which was also somewhat time-consuming and wonderful. So, I don't mean to put that out there to scare you, that this is something that takes so long, but to point out that a career in religious studies is not one that is linear and set in stone and paved for you. Once you get into Harvard Divinity School, it does not mean that your path is set and laid out before you. It is one that is guaranteed to have many twists and turns that are not expected, and this can be challenging and confusing, but the payoff for all of that is that you will have the world open to you in a whole new, incredible way that you never could have anticipated. And my life was forever changed by my experience here, and I'm very grateful that it took so long because it was really wonderful. So there are places, even in America, where you can grow up not knowing anybody who is not your own religious tradition. I grew up in a small town outside of Philadelphia of about 2,000 people, so I've got you beat, all of whom were Swedenborgians. So a tradition that nobody's ever even heard of, on top of the fact that, oh, you've heard of it, good. Most people have not, even here. So I actually didn't know anybody who was not Swedenborgian until I went away to college. It was a very insular community. My father was the town pastor. And if you're going to be surrounded by one religious tradition your whole childhood, Swedenborgianism is a pretty good one. They're pretty great people. But by the time I was college age, I was very ready to get out and find out what other people believed. So I attended Moravian College in Pennsylvania, a very small school. And I thought I would do education or psychology, which were interests of mine, but I couldn't stop taking religion classes. Each one was more interesting than the last, and I just fell in love with my professors there. And by the time I was done, I'd accidentally acquired a degree in religious studies And my professors encouraged me to consider graduate school in religious studies. I didn't know that you could do that. I actually didn't know that was an option. So great, I could do that, wonderful. And I landed at HDS. The reason why I chose Harvard Divinity School, as so many others have pointed out, I wanted a place that, I knew I wanted to do academic study. I knew I wasn't on a track for ministry, but I wanted to be surrounded by other people who were practicing their faith. And I wanted to be surrounded by Christians and non-Christians who were practicing their faith together in community. And HDS is one of the few places in the world that has that kind of environment alongside the incredibly rigorous academic environment as well. So I came here and I was not disappointed. When I was a student here, there were dorms. I lived in Rockefeller Hall, which is now an office building, but I lived there for 2.5 years. And I lived next to a rabbi on this side, a Korean Buddhist nun on that side. Literally, it was the most incredible environment for religious conversations that you can imagine. And right now, the only place that that kind of community still exists, people living together actually in community, is across the street at the CSWR, so I highly suggest you consider that if you do end up coming here. It was by far the most, as you mentioned, the most powerful part of my experience here was living actually in community and sharing meals with people of different faiths. How are we going to work out the kosher dishes? Like, complicated stuff. So I think that's all I really have to say. If anybody has concerns about being in grad school and having children at the same time, I'd be happy to talk to anybody about that. It is totally possible. Don't listen to people who say it's not, because there are those people out there and they're wrong. It can be done, and it can be done well. So I just wish you well on this path. You all have an adventure ahead of you, whatever you choose to do, and I hope it's a good one. Thank you.
We will not stay too long, but we've had 3 wonderful presentations out of 3 different life stories, and we have about, let's say 7 minutes or 8 minutes before we want to break and go across the street. Would anyone like to raise a question for all our panelists or for one of them in particular? Don't be shy to raise your hand.
Can I offer a little anecdote that I think you might appreciate? So my grandmother worked at Harvard. She worked for an anthropologist, faculty member. And she was working here at the time that the center was founded. So my family's tradition is Roman Catholic, Irish genre of Roman Catholic. And my mother told me this story last week. My grandmother did not understand what the point of the center of studying world religion, because she was here and she, So I just wanted to share the wonderful sort of coming full circle. I'm attracted to the Divinity School because of your program. And I'm, a product, that was my grandmother who didn't understand it. So I just wanted to offer that because it felt very special to me that I could be at the other end of a different spectrum.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And that prompts me to add a little autobiographical point that I'm a Catholic priest myself, an Irish Catholic. So I don't know if your grandmother's living or not, but she'll be turning over in her bed or grave or something to know that what goes around comes around. So, yeah. And there are people, and just that reminds me of the point that sometimes people think a place like Harvard, you have to be kind of detached from your tradition or kind of away from it or something like that. But actually, I think many people who come here find it's a way of deepening because, as our 3 speakers were saying, you're rubbing shoulders with people of other traditions. They're curious. You also have to redefine yourself. And I taught at Boston College for many years before coming over here, a Catholic Jesuit institution. And in some way, being here is forced kind of a redefinition, even at my age, that you figure yourself out in a very pluralistic place. And I think all 3 of our speakers have said that coming from different backgrounds here, you begin to look at yourself differently, and the education in the classroom is enhanced immeasurably by the education outside the classroom all around, but also as part of that at the center. So thank you for that. Other questions or comments?
I was very impressed by the stories, and I can see how the center is very self-fulfilling. But can any of you maybe tell us something about how to expand that self-fulfillment to bringing change beyond our own selves?
There's so many things. The center's, is this on? Hello? Is this on? The center's been through many, many iterations since I've been here, so it's hard to generalize. But there have definitely been programs throughout the years that have reached out to the community. I think of the Women Healing Women program that brought together women practitioners of all different modalities together, alternative, traditional healers, to do case studies together and support each other in their healing practice. That was a very powerful experience. We also do a lot of, there have been, especially recently, especially under Frank's directorship, there have been a lot of efforts to get involved in the interfaith communities in the yard with undergraduate students and the various chaplains at Harvard. Harvard has a very rich tradition of bringing together chaplains from different faiths to do programming together and to coordinate efforts. And so working with the undergraduate students, the center's been taking a leadership role there, which is really exciting. So there have been various projects through the years.
Either of you want to jump in?
I think you just pointed to one of the biggest struggles within the academy in general, which is how to apply in a real-world setting what you learn in the classroom and what you talk about with other people. Not just writing books, not just books talking to books, but books talking to people to make change. And I think that's a question that's still lingering out there.
I'm not sure if I would have too much to add to what Rebecca and Gibran just said, other than one thing I do see the CSWR doing is trying to enact the kind of conversations that are happening just within Harvard, and like expanding from the CSWR sort of to the next membrane out, being, Harvard itself. And as that conversation unfolds and the people in those conversations are sort of transformed in themselves through those conversations, hopefully I think the idea is it sort of ripples out from there too, to the rest of Harvard, but then the world in general. So there's, I think, that also going on a certain level that's maybe a little bit more subtle than the more obvious things that Rebecca had just mentioned as well.
Now we have time for one more question. Yes.
Are there any challenges that you face in working with, if you want to concentrate on a certain faith tradition, and then you get all those eclectic kind of different backgrounds? Are there any challenges that you face? Okay.
Oh yeah. It's a challenging thing. Yeah, how do you find a common language to begin with, to talk across boundaries? And how do you deal with language that's a problem for one party and not a problem for another party? So a lot of things around what's an acceptable topic of conversation, what's acceptable language when you're talking about it, who's allowed to be there. For some people, it's a problem to have a conversation with a woman about theological matters, and all kinds of questions around how do you even think about that? How do you begin thinking about that ethically, respectfully? There's so many angles. Very challenging. I have to give credit to the staff and the faculty here and the student body here. They think very, very carefully about these issues. Carrie Maloney is amazing, the director of Religious and Spiritual Life. she has a very beautiful mind, and she's very considerate of these kinds of challenges, and trying to create a space that is neutral enough to invite multiple perspectives, but also doesn't water down too much that the beauty is gone. I mean, that's a very, very delicate balance, and the people here think about that problem very carefully.
Yeah, I guess, and it's interesting that for some reason in my life, in the relationships that I've been having just in the last few weeks, the conversation has been coming up a lot from people who also, do want to take conversations in a lot of their classes to the next level, where sometimes it does kind of stay at a certain level because we're all coming from such different backgrounds, and nobody really wants to offend anybody else, and so I think there's an art about like having that perfect container that doesn't exist, but wanting to have some kind of a container in which the conversations can happen in classes where, there's going to be tension. People can disagree, but that can be held. And but you have to set it up right, beforehand, so that disagreement doesn't necessarily mean everything's going to fall apart. Disagreement is how we can have really, of course, fruitful conversations, as Rebecca was saying. And so, where I think the human thing in all of us is to kind of tend toward harmony, and there's a slight resistance to that tension. We have people like Carrie and people on staff who are sort of trying to create the counter narrative, and some professors who are really good, I think, at supporting going into those more tense areas that can really bring more fruitful dialogue as well.
I mean, I don't have too much to add, other than I think it's always best to be honest with yourself, to be honest about your doubts, about your own perception of your own tradition. And like I try to convey in my talk, it's okay to not have all the answers. It's okay to disagree. But again, in disagreeing, one has to recognize a certain sort of baggage that comes with everything, with anything that we touch, with everything that we talk about. So yeah.
Okay, I think our time is up for our formal session. The only thing I would add at the end is we've mentioned there's a reception across the street. The center is right across the street. The easiest door to enter is at the left end of the building. It goes straight into the back. And the reception you should think of as a non-event. It's not one more thing on your agenda. You can come and just sit and relax. There are nice things to eat and drink. There's some lovely artwork. There's a library upstairs. You can wander around the building. There's a lovely courtyard. So don't feel that you have to perform or do anything. You can just sit down and close your eyes if you want. If you're in a hurry and can stay 5 minutes, that's nice. If you can stay for an hour, that's nice too. So just come if you can, and we'll be there. And if you have any further questions or something, we can discuss them over there. But I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight. I'd like to thank Loida for making all the arrangements, and especially to thank our three panelists for wonderful presentations. Thank you.